Good afternoon to those of you joining the phone. Good morning to those folks that are to the west of us. And thanks everyone for joining in, tuning in today here in Last Minute as we take a look at the American Jobs Plan. That was at least the synopsis was released this week. There's been a lot of back and forth on what this means for transportation. And how it might happen in the current political climate here in Washington and what it means for transportation broadly. So I'm here with Jeff Davis. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff here in just a minute, who's going to walk through what we know and what it all means, and hopefully then get to some of your questions. So of course, on the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions function. A lot of you have submitted questions already via email or when you signed up, and we're going to hopefully get to some of those during the presentation and then follow up with folks after Jeff is done speaking. So please submit your questions as they come in, and we will get to those too. I also want to mention that we are launching this week our celebration of Eno's 100 years as an organization. We were founded in April of 1921. And we thought that this week would be a great week to launch the centenary because it's going to be a slow news week. We did not know, and the administration didn't get the memo that that was happening, and so they've also released their plan this week. So it's an exciting time where there's lots of questions, lots of things that folks are asking. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and Jeff's going to take it away, and then I'll rejoin for questions in a few minutes once he's done. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been an interesting last 27, 28 hours for us here, going through the fairly extensive summary document that the White House provided, and then trying to fill in some of the gaps here and there. So $2.3 trillion in spending with a T, and it can be broken up into 4 basic tranches. What we normally think of as infrastructure is about $932 billion, about 40% of the total. Other physical capital, $378 billion. Other federal investments, $580 billion. And then this thing with supporting community caregivers for child care and elder care jobs, $400 billion. The criticism from the Republicans has tended to be, this was originally billed as an infrastructure bill, and infrastructure is less than half of the spending. That is true, but if you look at it as a broader picture of the word investment instead of infrastructure, then under the definitions that are currently used, pretty much everything except that $400 billion for community caregivers does fall under that larger rubric of investment. Every year in the president's budget, there's a book called Analytical Perspectives, and one of those perspectives is about the OMB definition of federal investment, and they break that up into 3 buckets. Major public physical capital, of which infrastructure is a subset, but also things like housing, and building tangible things or buying tangible things, conduct of research and development, and conduct of education and training. That's what the federal budget every year considers to be investment. So when you look at it that way, here's what we've got. Everything, it's a $1.9 trillion in federal investments. You've got $571 billion for transportation infrastructure, $111 billion for drinking and wastewater infrastructure, $100 billion for broadband, $100 billion for power and electrical grid. And again, some of that stuff in there may not actually be technically infrastructure. Some stuff they're going to pay coal miners to clean up old coal mines instead of dig new coal mines, things like that. But I couldn't really pick and choose. And then resiliency upgrades for all of the above infrastructure is $50 billion. Under other physical capital, you've got building affordable housing, building public schools, building community colleges, building child care facilities, building tangible physical structures that would be owned by probably some level of government, so that's investment. Upgrading VA hospitals, and then that federal buildings revolving fund that OMB has been pushing for 5 years now. And then other investments, $180 billion for R&D, $300 billion investing in manufacturing. And I didn't do too deep a dive into that to figure out what really qualifies as investment and what doesn't. And $100 billion in workforce development. So conceivably, up to 1.9 trillion of the 2.3 trillion could be construed as actual federal investment in the OMB definition. So I would call this an investment bill instead of an infrastructure bill, but infrastructure is a key part of the investment part of the bill. $571 billion for transportation infrastructure. This is what I'm going to be spending the rest of this presentation on. You've seen the number in there of $174 billion in the summary document for electric vehicles. I'm told that is $160 billion in spending and $14 billion in tax incentives to try to help make EVs price competitive so people will buy them. Of that $160 billion, I'm told this morning that $25 billion they have penciled in for converting existing diesel mass transit buses to electric mass transit buses. And that is already considered to be mass transit spending under the current Low-No program, for example. So I have moved on my own prerogative $25 billion of the EV money under the mass transit category, which raises it from 85 to 110 billion. I believe that is a truer comparison of apples to apples than leaving it under EV. So the transit buses bring mass transit to $110 billion, about 19% of the total. The rest of the EV spending, excluding the tax incentives, 135 billion, 115 for highways, 80 for intercity rail. Around what I'm told is 44 billion for mega projects. There's some inconsistency between the White House and OMB and DOT on exactly when you call loan authority, comparing loan authority and credit authority versus spending versus tax incentives of private activity bond allocations, whatever. There's some play there. Airports and next gen air traffic control, 25 billion. Ports and ports of entry, 17 billion. A whopping $20 billion for road safety, and then $25 billion for a variety of equity-based concerns that I'll get into later. But that basically shows you how the $571 billion for infrastructure and transportation is distributed. Again, the people say $621 billion is the total. No, that 621 includes 50 for resiliency upgrades to all kinds of infrastructure, not just transportation, but specifically power grid and water resiliency as well. So that's not just transportation. So 571 in transportation infrastructure, quite a lot of money. This is spending that's supposed to be on top of what we're doing anyway. What we call the baseline is what we're already spending extrapolated for inflation. So the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, February 21 baseline for 5 years, because I'm also told that even though there's a mention elsewhere in the non-transportation part of the White House document of an 8-year time frame for the spending, I'm told that most of the transportation spending was conceptualized as 5-year money. I'm not sure whether it's going to be tranched out over 5 years in availability or done all at once. That's still unclear, but it's a 5-year comparison is what I'm told they're going for. So I took up the CBO February baseline projection for the next 5 fiscal years, 22, 23, 24, 26, excluding the one-time COVID money. And CBO's baseline is the actual FY21 appropriations plus an annual inflation bump each year. So you can see that the 5-year baseline of what we're already spending for highways is about 250 billion, and the 115 billion for the American Jobs Plan on top of that is about 46% over baseline. Mass transit, the baseline is 66 billion, and the 110, including the EV buses, is 167% above baseline. And then for railroads, Amtrak and the FRA grant programs, not FRA overhead and not FRA R&D, but the Amtrak grants and the three Fast Ag Railroad grant programs, 13.7 billion under the baseline, 80 billion on top of that is 584% above the 5-year baseline. So this is the modal administration preference one would expect from the president who likes to be called Amtrak Joe. That's pretty clear. Now, looking at how this is going to get accomplished, the choice of the pay for, in my personal opinion, probably is determinative of the process, because they've put out a proposal in the back of the document for permanent tax increases on corporations. They're going to take the rate, basic corporate rate, from 21 to 28, double the overseas rate, do a lot of other things about corporate taxes. That's supposed to raise around $2.3 trillion over 15 years. The choice of a $2 trillion corporate tax increase as your pay for strongly implies, in my opinion, that they're going for a 50 vote plus Vice President Harris strategy to get this thing to the Senate instead of a 60 vote strategy, because I cannot for the life of me think of 10 Senate Republicans who would be solidly for a $2 trillion corporate tax increase, even if they got some good swag for their state. And a 50 vote strategy, unless they get rid of the filibuster, and I still don't think that's going to happen, that means they go through the budget reconciliation process. The budget reconciliation process means there's a lot of things they can't do in this bill, and that includes most of what is in surface transportation reauthorization. I believe they cannot, because anything in the reconciliation, every provision, every line in the budget reconciliation bill has to have something to do with the federal deficit, has to affect the deficit somehow, up or down. And bailing out the Highway Trust Fund doesn't have an effect on the deficit. Those transfers don't score. Providing new contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund, which is the heart of a surface reauthorization, doesn't affect the deficit because that contract authority is subject to the annual obligation limitation of the appropriations bill. You can't make authorizations for future appropriations, which is the way we've traditionally funded Amtrak and mass transit new starts and those other rail programs, because that's dependent on what the appropriations committees do. The actual authorization itself has no effect on the deficit. Most of the stuff you dig into, a lot of changes in Title 23 highway law and Title 49 transit and rail law, just amending those, unless that amendment to the code specifically affects the dollar amounts being provided in this bill, isn't going to be allowed under budget reconciliation. And it's not 100% sure, but the parliamentarian has strongly implied that you can't do earmarks in a budget reconciliation bill. There's the more narrowly targeted spending is to a specific project or place, the more likely it is the parliamentarian won't allow it. And again, all those restrictions I just mentioned are Byrd rule restrictions in the Senate. You can waive them if you have 60 votes for a specific provision, but if you had 60 votes, you wouldn't be doing this in the first place on reconciliation. So I believe this means that the Highway Trust Fund / Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill has to move separately from the American Jobs Plan investment bill. And this would involve, in order to trigger this, Congress would have to pass a new budget resolution that would then order congressional committees, each committee to come up with X amount of spending or taxes or whatever, and then package them all together and go through the floor. The question is this which resolution would it be? Because we've already done one FY21 budget resolution that ordered reconciliation that was just signed into law for what the White House calls the American Rescue Plan, their COVID mostly bill. Do you do a second FY21 budget resolution? Are you allowed to? Or do you go ahead and do a FY22 resolution? If you're going to do an FY22 resolution, you really need to wait for the president's FY22 budget first, or you're just going to ignore it. Majority Leader Schumer in the Senate has asked the parliamentarian if it's permissible for them to do another a slightly revised FY21 budget resolution to order this round of reconciliation. To my knowledge, she hasn't ruled yet. I'm skeptical that she will, because under Mr. Schumer's logic, there's no end to it. The law is vague, but if you interpret it as allowing multiple reconciliation resolutions in a fiscal year, there's no reason that you can't do 10 or 12 of them a year. The Senate would do nothing but budget resolutions or reconciliation bills over and over all year for 8 months. And I'm not sure Liz McDonough, the parliamentarian, wants to set herself up for that. So again, anything can happen over there. It's a weird place, but I'm not at all sure that the parliamentarian will allow multiple FY21 reconciliation processes. So we may have to wait for FY22. And that would also call into question when you could do the next big reconciliation bill, which would be social welfare programs that would be funded by increased taxes on individuals, because all these pay fors are corporate taxes, not individual. Biden is saving his promised tax increases on rich people to fund something else down the line. There are key unanswered questions. Again, there's some good specificity in this document, but there's a lot that's not answered. Number one big question is, all this grant money for state and local governments, is there going to be a matching share required, or is it 100% federal share? That is the multi-$100 billion question. And it's vague, and I'm told that, like on background, that this is something they're going to be leaving up to Congress. I believe for a lot of these programs, they're going to want at least some kind of matching share, but whether it's, 10%, 20%, 40%, depends on the program, that is going to be left up to negotiations with Congress. Another question, what formulas will be used to distribute this money, presuming that most of the major highway and transit money at least will be formula based? Don't know. They're leaving that vague as well to work with Congress. ENO has done a lot of work proving how the current highway distribution formula makes no sense at all. It would be nice to see this money given out based on updated needs, but we'll see how that works out in the political process. It's difficult. The process by which the $44 billion in aid for mega projects are selected, that is going to be one of the highest profile things in this bill. And then also the big question is, all this spending is above baseline, above what we're spending now. Will the president's budget also call for increasing spending in this year and future years in the existing programs? And we were hoping to get a partial skinny budget this week of the president's. It would just be the president's discretionary appropriations proposals for FY 2022 by itself. That may be today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. There's a little turmoil over there. But that will tell us some things, because the president's regular budget proposal for Amtrak and for those FRA grant programs and for mass transit capital investment grants should be in that document. Those are the appropriated programs. So what the president proposes for those programs for FY 22 should also be indicative of what he'll propose for the mandatory contract authority stuff later on down the line for 22. Is it going to be basically what we're spending now, and the reconciliation bill is all the growth we're going to get and it's one-time growth, or will there also be growth in the regular programs over the years assumed in the budget? Those are in my opinion, the biggest four unanswered questions right now. And now we're going to go a bit into looking at this mode by mode. And again, to their credit, I think this is a good thing in that the summary document is trying to move away from using money as the sole metric of what you're doing. The amount of money that's spent really, shouldn't be the metric, because it's actually what you're getting out of it, what you're buying and what you're building. Because it's, if you just use, this is also why I've been critical of construction jobs as a metric for success, because spending $1 billion on a smart project that's going to help a lot of people move is fundamentally different than spending $1 billion on a stupid white elephant project that's not particularly effective or could move things backwards in some ways. But if all your metric is the amount of money you spend in the construction jobs, then a dumb project is just as good as a smart project. So I firmly believe we should move away from using the dollar amount spent as our major metric of what we're doing. And and to their credit, the Biden document from the NEC tries to put tangibles, deliverables out there of what this money is supposed to be buying. So they say that $150 billion for highways should be able to modernize 20,000 miles of roads, reconstruct some huge major bridges, and repair 10,000 smaller bridges, and modernize the bridges, highways, roads, and main streets that are in most critical need of repair. And they mentioned this is a fix-it-first, the fix-it-first proposal, meaning to get everyone back to, the states or recipients of this money should put getting existing infrastructure back to a state of good repair ahead of building new capacity, new facilities, et cetera. Because again, I personally am sick and tired of hearing everyone talk about our crumbling infrastructure is the problem, yet talk about shiny new things as being part of the solution. If crumbling infrastructure is the big problem, state of good repair should be the first and by far the biggest thing you're going to do. And if you're going to prioritize things that are not state of good repair, then shut up about crumbling infrastructure, because you're not helping. The highway money here, again, it's a big question on formulas that goes out. I will say that when they're talking about highway money, I can almost believe they're going to do a bunch of this through the existing CMAQ program, because the document says, quote, funding to improve air quality, limit greenhouse gas emissions, and reduce congestion on point, which is, CMAQ to a T. So some of that goes out in CMAQ. Some of this will go out under, I presume, the existing NHPP or Surface Transportation Block Grant formulas. But just the question, so the question of how they would write Fix It First into those existing program, the NHPP and Surface Transportation Block Grant money, would they use some of the language that was in HR2 last year? Now that I come to think of it, I don't think the administration is going to be putting out a detailed bill. So it's as long as they're saying Fix It First, I would expect that Chairman DeFazio would take the lead on using the same approach to Fix It First that they did in HR2 last year. And again, they talk about fix the most economically significant large bridges in the country in need of reconstruction, unquote. So that brings to mind the Brent Spence Bridge, which was Mr. McConnell's top priority, a few others. But at the top end of there, once you talk about structures that cost, a couple $1 billion, there's a question of whether those are better addressed as part of highway formula money or as part of the mega projects pot that's going to be later on. So that's highways. Then they're putting a proportionately phenomenal amount of money into road safety, quote, increases to existing safety programs. And that's a pretty big increase because, all the grant programs at NHTSA and motor carriers together for highway safety and motor carrier safety are about 1.1 billion a year. And then even if you take the most broadly expansive definition of current road safety programs, and then you then include the 2.4 billion a year in pre-transfer contract authority for the highway safety improvement program through FHWA, that's still 3.5 billion a year, and 20 billion is almost 6 times that. So that's a lot of money for road safety. And I will say they say, quote, a new Safe Streets for All program to fund state and local Vision Zero plans and other improvements to reduce crashes and fatalities, especially for cyclists and pedestrians. So all you bike ped folks out there, bear that in mind, that in addition to what I presume will be an emphasis on complete streets projects in the highway stuff, in the highway money, 115, a lot of bike ped safety stuff presumably will come out of this $20 billion for road safety, which is a massive increase over the existing levels. Then mass transit at 110, including that 25 billion for e-buses that I mentioned earlier. Going to quote, modernize existing transit and help agencies expand their systems to meet rider demand, unquote. So unlike the highway money, which is explicit Fix It First and implicitly discouraging new capacity, the transit money will explicitly fund new capacity and expansion of existing systems. So the big question is going to be, how are they going to divide that money? The 25 billion for e-buses, the remaining 85. How will they divide that between state of good repair for existing systems and facilities and building new capacity in systems? And particularly, it's on the new capacity in systems, are they going to do this through the existing CIG capital investment grant program? Because again, there's a lot of long lead time there, and there's not a lot of projects that are, except for, Hudson River Tunnel, which I'll get to later, just ready to roll on that program. And because this money to be provided has to be spent out, it'll be interesting to see how long they make, how much money will be divided between steady good repair and new capacity, and how long they leave the new capacity money out there for, because there's plenty of stuff on the drawing board that wouldn't be necessarily ready to even apply for a full funding grant agreement for another couple of years, but are down the road. And also, again, this is in a $85 billion program, of which say half of it, say, 42.5 billion hypothetically would be new capacity instead of steady good repair. That Hudson River Tunnel wants $6 billion out of this program. So that's still a huge amount of money. So whether Hudson River Tunnel as part of Gateway would come out of this budget or the $44 billion mega project budget is also a key question. Then railroads, President Amtrak Joe, $80 billion to, quote, address Amtrak's repair backlog, modernize the Northeast Corridor, improve existing corridors, and connect new city pairs, and enhance the grant and loan programs you've already got. explicitly, that's a lot of new capacity. But so the big question becomes, how do you divide this up between Amtrak capital and the Northeast Corridor, which is owned by Amtrak, and everywhere else? Amtrak said the other day that their Northeast Corridor capital backlog is $31 billion. I think they've got $2 or $3 billion of capital backlog in the rest of the country, but it's Northeast Corridor. That's 31 billion off the top of the 80, apparently, before you get into modernization of the corridor to allow faster trains. So if you left it to its own devices, the Northeast Corridor could easily eat the entire $80 billion. I don't think that's what President Biden has in mind, and I'm certain that Congress would never allow the NEC to eat the entire 80 billion. So it'll be curious to see how they wind up dividing this up. Amtrak, of course, comes out yesterday and has a new map of what they would of a new route they want to serve, including metropolis like Eau Claire, a route to Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Yeehaw! So they've optimal what they want to do as far as serving new routes. And then you get into the issue of high-speed rail. I mean, if you take $30 billion off the top for the NEC capital backlog, that would leave 50. And the California project alone has at least a $60 billion hole in its revenue. And once they get the tunneling for the full EIS and cost estimates for those tunnels under the Tehachapi Range and the San Gabriel's, et cetera, it's going to be more than that. They're going to need another $75–80 billion from somewhere. They would, of course, love for the federal government to provide all that money, but just keep in mind that $80 billion sounds like a lot, and it's far, far more than we're currently investing. But if you really believe in developing high-speed rail, 80 billion is a drop in the bucket. I think the president said something yesterday about the dream of coast-to-coast high-speed rail, and I just went because you need to add another zero to that if you're going to talk about high-speed rail. Closer to 800 billion rather than 80 billion dollars would start to make a dent. And even then, I refuse to believe that people are ever going to take a 220-mile-an-hour train from Chicago to LA unless you make 550-mile-an-hour airplanes illegal. And until you get serious about outlawing air travel because of the carbon emissions, then there's people stop talking about coast-to-coast high-speed rail, start talking about city pairs that'll actually work. But basically, yeah. So 80 billion sounds like a lot of money. If you're talking about significant high-speed rail networks, 80 billion is not a lot of money, and the Northeast Corridor, left to its own devices, could easily eat that entire 80 billion back where the population density is the highest. So dividing it up between the NEC and everywhere else will be the most difficult task, I think. Then you've got aviation, $25 billion for airports and, quote, upgrades to FAA assets that ensure safe and efficient air travel, unquote, which I'm presuming to mean the ongoing next-gen air traffic control conversion to allow planes to be clustered closer together while, and more efficient on the routes while still maintaining our world-leading safety record. Now, talking about airport grants, there's the existing airport improvement program, AIP. They say they're going to fund that. They don't say how much. But AIP is traditionally devoted to what we call air side. It's runways, taxiways, lighting, and the safety stuff. And the justification that was always that AIP was, until recently, a user-funded program, paid for by the ticket tax and the segment fees. And so they wanted to reserve. That's why the justification always been there to reserve AIP for airside. This money is going to be coming presumably out of the general fund, so there's no user pay justification here. So the document also says, in addition to funding AIP, they will also be funding a new program for what the rest of us call ground side stuff, terminal renovations and multimodal connections that will allow people to get to the airport without using an automobile. I'm not sure, if how much, the air train to LaGuardia, whatever it is on Long Island, not sure if that qualifies, but things like that. So you'll have some amount for next gen, then existing IAP airside developments and the new airport grant program for ground side development. And they are not telling us, of course, yet how, which of these three buckets is going to get which amount of money under the Biden plan. Then Ports get $17 billion. Quote, inland waterways, coastal ports, land ports of entry, and ferries, which are all essential to our nation's freight. And it includes a, quote, healthy ports program to mitigate the cumulative impacts of air pollution on neighborhoods near ports, often communities of color, unquote. It's been a high priority of some of the Democrats from the Southern California delegation, I know, because around the LA, Long Beach, San Pedro mega port complex there. They don't tell us how this is going to be divided up between the Corps of Engineers, which runs the inland waterway system and which dredges coastal ports, versus Maritime Administration, which has the land side of ports at DOT, versus, you know, Customs and land ports of entry, and versus ferries, which are funded either by federal highways or federal transit administration, depending on what kind. So again, I'm sure that the administration has some numbers penciled in somewhere about how they ideally would want to divvy that up, but they're not telling us, and we'll wait and see how this all, you know, how it would translate into whatever Congress would want. And then you get to, oh wow, my phone reminder just went off as I get to the equity program. Quote, a new program that will reconnect neighborhoods cut off by historic investments and ensure new projects increase opportunity, advance racial equity and environmental justice, and promote affordable access, unquote. I'm told that the total for this is $25 billion. There may have been a typo. Some of the amounts in the summary document don't quite add up to the advertised top line total. I'm told that some of that's because of the, you know, the differences between whether you count tax incentives as spending or not, and some other stuff. So, but I believe this is about $25 billion on the equity side of things. And I'm also told that this is inclusive of equity-focused planning grants, some funding for clean infrastructure R&D, you know, clean kinds of pavement, et cetera, that, and workforce training. Then you get into electric vehicles. And I mentioned earlier that you take it's 135 in spending after you take the 25 billion for transit buses out. Quote, establish grant and incentive programs for state and local governments and the private sector to build a national network of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030, unquote. That's the big chunk of money in there, where they don't say exactly how much that is. I presume it's a big chunk. Now, I can only imagine that the prerequisite for that is that someone in a position of authority in the federal government needs to have a big sit-down meeting with Elon Musk and the people from GM and Ford and Toyota and Volkswagen, et cetera, and hash out one kind of plug-in that can be used for all EVs, you know, not just the, you know, for the physical adapter and the software, because I cannot imagine anything more wasteful than the federal government putting untold billions of dollars into building a nationwide network of EV chargers that are compatible with all different kinds of passenger cars. So that is an inherent prerequisite in this, is bringing some kind of sense to the physical ability of being able to plug your car into a charger. Now they're going to try to make e-vehicles price competitive at the get-go with point of sale rebates, don't know how much, and that $14 billion in tax incentives that I mentioned earlier. Because as I believe Secretary Buttigieg said in his testimony the other day, that if you know, eventually you'll be able to get to the point where that if you make it price competitive at the purchase price, people will then eventually, for anyone who doesn't have to go 500 miles at a jump routinely, the savings you will get in on maintenance would make the finances much more attractive. But until then, they're going to be trying to make the purchase price more competitive with rebates and tax incentives. And in addition to that, 25 billion for electric transit buses that have already removed from here, I'm told the amount of money they penciled in to electrify 20% of the yellow school bus fleet in this country is another $20 billion. And then they're going to electrify the federal vehicle fleet and the postal vehicle fleet. So, and that's something they can do internally. I'm not sure, you know, again, the big question is, do you run a life cycle cost analysis, and at what point do you junk a fairly recent model year internal combustion engine car just to replace it with an electric car? Because, you know, the cost of of mining, of digging all these materials out of the ground, refining them into metals and plastics, building a car. There's a lot of carbon released in the construction cycle of an electric vehicle, and it doesn't necessarily, even if the tailpipe emissions are infinitely better, it doesn't necessarily make sense to junk all of the existing internal combustion engines at once. So there's the outline of the EV component, and then finally we get into the mega projects. 44 billion, which may be inclusive of private activity bond authority, loan authority, some RIF stuff, etc. Which are, quote, to quote, accelerate transformative investments from pre-development through construction, turning shovel-worthy ideas into shovel-ready projects, which is quite a clever turn of phrase, I thought. And it, quote, includes 25 billion for a dedicated fund to support ambitious projects that have tangible benefits to the region or national economy, but are too large or complex for existing funding programs, unquote. The Hudson River Tunnel would obviously fit in that because it's really too big for, they're wanting $6 billion out of the Federal Transit Administration fund for new subways and new light rail. Even though the tunnel is owned by Amtrak and the EIS process is going to the Federal Railroad Administration, and the tunnel will be owned by Amtrak, but it would be mostly used by New Jersey Transit. So, it would, the Hudson Tunnel would be a fit for this mega projects program. The problem is that you need to get this bill enacted fairly quickly, otherwise because people keep saying that the Hudson River Tunnel is so time sensitive. We'll see. There are a bunch of other projects out there, but again, when you get to the project of this magnitude, project selection process is everything. I can't wait to see what the administration proposes for the rules by which the Secretary of Transportation will select projects versus what members of Congress will the restrictions try to force on him. This kind of thing is really too big. They're going back to earmarks. I cannot believe that they would actually have earmarks that large, but we'll see. You can draw it up as saying that it must be a project that crosses between state lines and has X number, the price, it's like with the infra program. For projects to be eligible for infra, they have to be over a certain amount or over a certain multiplier of the highway formula money that the states together normally get. So you could see, some kind of de minimis project size based on percentage of the money that the states are normally getting, et cetera. But so that's 44 billion for mega projects, which is going to have most of the curiosity in this, and then that is the extent of the $571 billion list. And now we'd be happy to take questions.
All right. Thanks for that, Jeff. We've got a bunch of questions here from Eau Claire wanting to clarify your questions there on Amtrak. I'm just kidding. But no, really, there's a ton of questions coming in. I'm going to try to get it to as many of them as I can, and I'm going to try to also recognize that many of you have asked questions already that I think that Jeff has addressed. But if for some reason he didn't, or you have follow-up, please follow up in the questions function on the control panel here. But one of the questions I'm going to kind of go back before we get into the specifics of the modal parts of this is just kind of giving us a sense of what's next with this, right? We've seen the summary document. Is the administration planning on pulling together legislative text, or are they leaving that to Congress? And then what's the timing for Congress to put together actual level legislative details, and specifically, how do folks on the phone help shape that final outcome?
I'm not getting the sense that the Biden administration is going to go all out and produce a full legislative text. They didn't do that for the COVID bill. And Speaker Pelosi has indicated, I believe she said something yesterday, that she'd prefer to have this thing through the House and Senate and at least into conference by the July 4th recess, or maybe even sign into law by the July 4th recess. I can't remember which. So, but there's a couple of different steps. First of all, if they're doing this by reconciliation, and I believe they will, they have to pass a new budget resolution. That'll take the House and Senate, so that'll take the House and Senate, a week and a half, 2 weeks to mark up the resolution, and then they got to order committees to report their reports. So that would take, from that point that they pass a resolution that tells each committee of Congress how much money it has to spend, and then the committees would spend a couple of more weeks drafting and holding lengthy committee markups like we saw on the COVID justified bill a couple of months ago, and then to the floor. The beauty of reconciliation is that it's exempt from filibuster in the Senate, and all you get is 20 hours of debate plus the tedious vote-a-rama of 40, 50, 60 roll call votes in a row at the end, and then but also the last rescue bill was pre-conferenced. The House and Senate committee leaders and the leadership on the Democratic side had gone through and pretty much drafted the bill, identical bills, before they moved through committee, and so that eliminated the need for a House-Senate conference process at the end to resolve differences, because the Senate only made a couple of changes and the House could live with those. I can't see that happening this time. In a bill this big and this complex with this many things, I suspect that the Senate won't be able to restrain itself from amending the House product in at least a few substantive ways that would require a House-Senate conference committee, and then you would eventually get that back. So again, it's if they start, in the next couple of weeks with a new budget resolution from somebody, that's when the question of whether they can just amend the existing FY21 budget resolution and order a new reconciliation bill, or if they have to come up with a new 2022 budget resolution, which would presumably need the president's budget, to be released first so you could see what you're doing. That could be the real holdup, is the delays in getting a real budget proposal out of this administration, because the skinny budget we've been told to release this week only covers about 1/3 of total federal spending, and nothing on taxes until only 1 year. So you need a 5 or 10-year budget plan that shows tax levels and spending and mandatory spending and discretionary spending, all that, out of the administration before you could responsibly do a FY22 budget resolution. So that may delay things somewhat.
Got it. And related, as it pertains to budget reconciliation, if Congress decides to proceed with budget reconciliation to put together this proposal, do they have to use existing programs like CMAQ and others as the vehicle to get these priorities out, or can they create new programs?
They can create new programs and they can use existing programs, as long as the money is provided in the reconciliation bill itself and not left subject to future action by the Appropriations Committee or any other committee. They could do what they did in the COVID thing and just, create a program right there in the bill and fund it directly with an appropriation. Or they could just say, in addition to other money provided, there's hereby appropriated $10 billion for FHWA to be apportioned by XYZ under the CMAQ program in section 167, something like that, whatever, of Title 23. So they could go either way, as long as they actually provide the money via appropriation or some other form of mandatory budget authority in the reconciliation bill itself.
Got it. A couple questions, and I just want to say for the folks tuning in, there will be a recording of this webinar and the slides available on our website here in a few hours following the webinar. So you will be able to take a look at this again, and you will be able to continue to ask us questions. If we don't get to everything here in the next 15 minutes, please email me or Jeff, and we can certainly get to you on that. But one question that's come up a couple times, Jeff, is the issue of freight, from a modal perspective. Something that we've seen a lot in recent bills for surface transportation, but was kind of conspicuously absent here. Any thoughts about freight components and where that fits in?
The 17 billion in port money is explicitly to, let me find it here, because it talks about the ports because they're, quote, all essential to our nation's freight, unquote. So they're explicitly, getting more port capacity for freight movement on that side. And the $80 billion in rail money that says investment in passenger and freight rail service, unquote. They don't give any kind of other answer for what investing in freight rail might look like. The problem has always been that, investing in freight rail usually inherently involves writing checks to large for-profit corporations called railroads that already own these assets. So how they wind up squaring that will be interesting. But on the highway side, as far as highway freight goes, there are no good answers. Again, to the extent that they are discouraging new capacity in favor of fix it first, we'll see how much that goes for congestion relief on crowded freight corridors. But that's still a very vague area.
Got it. Another thing related to e-buses, something that you brought up a couple of times. There's the purchase of the physical buses, but equally expensive, if not more complicated, is creating the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, the grid infrastructure, the garages to service and charge those. Anything in the bill or the discussion, or not bill, but in the summary about e-bus infrastructure?
That is an excellent question I hadn't thought of. The document is explicit. It says 50,000 e-buses, e-transit buses, and I'm told that they're penciled in 25 billion for that. So the math says they're assuming $500,000 per bus cost, and that's already a good bit under the sales price of an electric bus today. It's closer to $700,000-800,000, I think. So presumably they are assuming economies of scale down the line once you put in that much demand for more of them. But yeah, at 50,000 buses times $500,000 a piece, there's no money left in that 25 billion really for mass transit e-bus charging infrastructure. So whether or not mass transit agencies can get funding for charging infrastructure out of the remaining 100 and whatever billion for the electric vehicle program, or whether it has to come from their own capital funding, whether from this bill or another bill, I'm not quite sure. It doesn't say.
So something I noticed in the summary document is the distinction that they make between shovel-worthy and shovel-ready projects. And that begs the question of how, when we're selecting these projects, we as a country, right? How are we going to make the distinction and between such types of projects? And is there a role for administrative earmarks through a process similar to what's done in infra and build? Is there congressional earmarks, or are a lot of the decisions going to be devolved to states and localities and transit agencies as to what projects are the best use of this money?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I would presume that they would try to, do a little more heavy into data evaluation and metrics and trying to make those decisions. As I mentioned before, we had when I first joined Eno 5 years ago, we had the Australian economists come up to talk about how they divide that labor, and they just had a national centralization. All projects above a certain dollar amount are evaluated on one comprehensive benefit cost analysis and the rest of the benefits by the central government, and then the state governments could, or provincial, whatever they call them, could pick and choose which parts of their federal and state money to use in which projects, as long as they obey, as they did it according to those criteria. So there's definitely some room for additional guidance for state and local governments as of how they should prioritize relative projects. But for the big money stuff, there's going to be a stronger federal role in that, maybe actually having DOT do the project selection themselves, or Congress. But once you get down to smaller projects where they're still going to be left up to state and local transit agencies, maybe a better tie into those performance metrics that we spent years developing and don't use, conditional performance metrics might be worthwhile.
So there was a portion, I think, not included in the transportation infrastructure part, but had to do with training and education. Does some of that bleed into this, or is there some education training component? One of the questions we just got is about specific on maintenance training and upskilling for the e-bus part of the puzzle here.
I honestly did not get to the end there, but there are workforce development provisions throughout this bill, and I would say with almost certainty that for things like that for training about how to maintain e-buses versus diesel buses, the Biden administration will put some money in there somewhere. But I honestly did not get through all of the non-transportation parts of the document at the end.
Got it. A follow-up question on one that we were just talking about with earmarks and project selection. Someone has a question about formulas and what formulas might be used to distribute some of this money. Jeff, you and I wrote about this in a paper a year and a half ago where we talked about the existing formulas and some of the problems with them. Any insight from folks on the Hill or in the administration about different formulas or different approaches to them?
No inside feedback yet, but again, the existing formula for the highway money is distributed on is based on largely but a lot of facts on the ground as they existed in 2007, VMT, population, lane mile extent, whatever, bridge condition, plus how much you pay in the gas tax. The administration is adamant they don't want a gas tax increase to pay for this bill, and if all this money is coming from the general fund and paid for by corporate whatses, there's zero reason to use a state's gasoline taxes as any kind of metric for how much they're going to get out of this. The mass transit formulas are updated annually and based on real events and then make much more sense. But even then, in the aggregate, there are some weighting issues that you could pick and choose and change. But yeah, you'll wind up with the same list of winners and losers, where the states that pay a lot of gas tax may get even more resentful that they're not getting what they believe to be their fair share of corporate money. And then you'll have people in places like New York and Biden's home state of Delaware talk about, hey, corporations are headquartered here. We're due even more money. We're actually paying for this, by taxes on corporate America. So I would just hope that we would go with this money towards actual needs-based or formulas, or else, looking more specifically at what you're going to build and doing non-formulas. Again, I point out the interstate system was built. You had the map first. You drew the map and knew where the roads were going to go, and then you didn't use a real funding formula. You just said, okay, every year, here's what we got to go to build that system. Here's what we're going to get, and so you kept throwing money at it based on who hadn't finished yet building that map. So it's basically, the interstate was built as one big project that crossed 48 states instead of a program. And I think that there is room for that, especially we're going to be talking about that's interstate rail stuff later on.
Got it. So a question about project costs. Could some of the money that's going toward manufacturing be used to kind of somewhat cross-subsidize the transportation manufacturing components for bus and rail, et cetera, and thereby lowering project costs and kind of having a bonus effect?
Presumably so, yes. And also, again, there are explicit mentions throughout this document that they are heavily into Buy America and heavily into union jobs. So, a lot of this document is assembled, I believe, this approach is being taken to make sure that the industrial unions stay inside the tent, and they've done a good job with that. So yeah, I would anticipate that when you're talking about how much you can get, especially on rail stuff, whether it's transit rail or intercity rail, The lack of domestic manufacturers headquartered here makes some of that difficult. But yeah, I would certainly imagine that some of the manufacturing money would go towards manufacturing capacity for transportation rolling stock, not just other kinds of manufacturing.
And related, would you expect a ban on Chinese state-owned enterprises like CRRC and BYD to apply here, like what was included in HR2 last year?
Yeah, I mean, if Mr. DeFazio has anything to say about it, it will. And again, the questions becomes, what to do about the CRRC assembly plant in Ways and Means Chairman Neal's district. That's basically what it boils down to, of how can they best exclude CRRC without costing several hundred jobs in the Ways and Means Chairman's district.
Got it. So we're got about 5 minutes left. There's just a couple questions about kind of next steps. What's you talked about this a little bit at the beginning of our question, but what do you think the prospects of this are for actually happening?
I think they're pretty good. I mean, it's such a narrowly divided House that you can see any grouping of, and if they do this as a mostly party line thing, then any grouping of 6 or more Democrats can blow the whole thing up for any reason. It was easier to keep them all on board on the COVID aid. We'll see. They're going to have a lot of traps to fulfill. You already got progressives saying that this bill is not enough, and so the Biden administration may have to make more explicit promises about what comes in the next big bill down the line before they are able to move this. You've seen there's a few Democrats from New York and New Jersey are in Connecticut where we're talking about they're not going to vote for a bill unless the state and local tax deduction for individuals is fully restored. I think they can successfully move that because this bill pay-fors don't mention individual taxes at all. They may be able to push those guys off towards the next bill, which will be financed by individual income tax changes. But we'll see. And it's got a chance, but threading the needle in a 6-vote majority House and a 50-50 Senate is awfully difficult. And if they're able to do it, it's going to be an epic achievement.
All right. Well, I know that's a good note to end on, and it's obviously this is something we're going to be following very closely and tracking over the next couple of days and weeks. Again, if anyone has any specific questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out to me directly at plewis@enotrans.org or to Jeff. Both of our email addresses are on our website. Also, I want to encourage everybody to check out our 100-year website, 100years.enotrans.org. There's some interactive elements, a forum where we're asking some tough questions and hoping that you all answer some of those, not just about some of the things that are going on right now and at this moment, but things that have been going on for a long time. So we want to stay engaged, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.